Before I get started, I would like to thank all of the fine folks who are bringing the Posscon conference to all of us and thank them for inviting me to speak here. And I would like to thank Brian especially for making this possible for me and for making me the recipient of the 2010 NCOSE Award for K-12 education. So that was pretty. All right. And of course with that we will have operator error with the lovely computer. Come on. I was actually telling Bryant this before I started. I have a curse. My AV has never worked once with a presentation.
Does amazing work, but she really is cursed.
It's true.
Gonna go to sleep?
Yeah, if you're
Hooray.
going to sleep with no power cord plugged in, you have to.
I have a power cord plugged in.
Okay. I saw the Apple light go out.
No, it's okay. I'm telling you,
Okay.
I'm special like that. Anyway, it's just how it goes. So before I get started, how many of the folks in the audience are students? Excellent. How many of you are currently contributing to open source projects? All right, so some of this is going to be a little boring to you, but that's okay. You can shout out any acknowledgments to your fellow students who need help getting started, et cetera, et cetera. And here we go. So my name is Leslie Hawthorn, as Bryant mentioned. I was actually born and raised in Silicon Valley and got a job there in high tech right out of college, which made me one of 3 people living in Silicon Valley, working in high tech, who was actually born and from there. And I recently emigrated to Portland, Oregon, and as you can see, I'm a huge fan of Oregon, just like everyone who lives there. Prior to moving on up to Portland, I worked at Google as a program manager in their open source programs office, where I managed their Summer of Code program, as well as coming up with its high school cousin, both of which I will talk about in just a moment. Since going up to Oregon, I have been privileged enough to land at the Oregon State University Open Source Lab. Any of you folks in the audience heard of the OSL? All right, represent. Just to give folks a brief overview, the OSL was founded in 2003 and provides hosting and infrastructure to more than 100 open source projects, including some that you've heard of like Debian, Apache, the Linux kernel. In addition to doing hosting and infrastructure for open source projects, we also do our own open source software development. And we have a public sector program helping folks in government learn how to adopt and deploy open source software. So, why open source? I promised this talk was going to be about the why, how, and where to get started with open source. So, as far as why open source, how many of you guys are working in IT shops, software development houses? I see a couple of hands. How much open source do you folks actually use? 100%, 10%, 0%? David?
95%.
95%? I saw another hand over here.
Less than 5%.
Less than 5%. Okay, that's quite a disparity. So according to the latest report put out by the Gartner analyst firm, it looks like about 50% of the leading IT companies that they surveyed are now making use of open source, citing competitive advantage. And their use of open source within the last 5 years has grown from approximately 10% of all the software in a particular company's portfolio to about 30%. So the key takeaway there is, hey, there's a lot of companies out there doing IT and they're using open source, which leads to the following point. Employers value open source experience. Probably pretty obvious. In terms of the reasons why employers are looking for folks with open source experience, it's not simply that these are the tools that they're using. This is a great way to evaluate potential hires. It's one thing to interview someone and have them interview really, really well with your firm. It's another thing entirely to be able to go and look at their code online and see what they've actually produced, how they make comments, how well their code is documented, seeing what's in their comments. Do they make the same kind of jokes that the folks on your team make? Are they going to be a good culture fit? Also, if you consider that if you come into a role and you already have open source experience and your employer is using open source, that's less time they have to spend training you and less time until you're fully productive. For all the students in the room, just to get a sense, how many of you are using version control in any of your courses? And that, my friends, just proved my point, not a single hand raised. So the great thing about open source software development is you get exposure to the entire open source tool chain. This is everything from mailing lists to version control systems to actually understanding how to maintain a large code base and not just do a single classroom project that you do a lot of work on, you turn it in, and you never touch again. So, open source and you, why should you care? We've already talked about creating a citable body of work that you can give to potential employers. I think mostly the reason to get involved in open source is not just because you want to get a great job. That's quite nice. but really it's about a passion for programming, a passion for tinkering, a passion for creating things, a passion for breaking something so that you could fix it or make it work the way you want it to, which is a very powerful thing. It's also an opportunity to learn stuff outside the classroom that you're not going to be taught there, so why not explore more on your own? If I have one regret from college, it's that I spent far too much time doing classwork and not enough experimenting with other fun stuff. And as we'll touch on a little bit later in this presentation, this is a great way to make a real difference in people's lives. So we'll chat about that at the end. So, how to get involved in open source. How many of you would like to get involved in open source? I like that. That's way better than the number of hands for using version control. Very good. All right. So there's the traditional route to getting involved in open source. Trial by fire. So the great thing about trial by fire is you get nice and warm and you learn a lot. The bad thing about trial by fire is you can get burned. What I mean by trial by fire is typically someone who wants to get involved in an open source project goes to the project website, looks through their issue tracker, finds a bug, maybe knows how to submit a patch, maybe has a lot of troubles setting up their development environment, maybe submits a patch and gets it rejected for a style guideline violation, not a lot of feedback, maybe the feedback's a little cranky pants, depending on how someone's feeling that day, and the response to this new would-be contributor is not one that's welcoming necessarily, and so they're like, yeah, thanks, bye. So if you don't feel like you're ready for trial by fire, that's cool. We are here to help. One great way to get involved in Summer of Code, in open source, if you are a student, is the Google Summer of Code program. How many people are familiar with this? All right, excellent. For those of you who are not familiar with the Google Summer of Code program, I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail about it. The genesis of the program was in 2005, where Google was evaluating all of their new engineering hires and finding that they were technically brilliant, wonderful at all kind, computing theory, design, all that kind of great stuff, did not know how to use the basics of the software toolchain, had never used version control. If they had gotten a summer job and an internship, they might have gotten a really great job at their local camera store, for example, but they hadn't actually had the opportunity to work on large-scale code bases. This is not a positive thing. So Larry Page basically said, hey, this is a problem we can solve, and the response to that was the creation of the Summer of Code program. The idea here being that Google will matchmake between university students and open source projects who are looking for talent. And students apply to work with the open source project says, that sounds great. Google pays the student $5,000 to complete a 3-month coding project. At the end of that 3 months, the open source project has some great code and hopefully a new contributor. So there's more than 175 open source projects participating in Google Summer of Code this year. This is everything from machine translation, solid state modeling, humanitarian and disaster relief, content management systems, you name it. Anything that you are interested in computer science is represented in Summer of Code. And the great thing about it is these are open source projects that have come to the fore and said, we are looking to work with people who are not as experienced as we are. We are looking for folks that we can mentor and help to become more effective programmers and contributors to our community. So if you are interested in this, and I highly recommend everyone apply, and I can give my little speech about why you shouldn't be intimidated if you want, but I'll save that for the end. March 28th is when student applications open, and they close on April the 8th. So you've got plenty of time after Posscon to go check out the participating open source projects, see what kinds of ideas they've put out there for you to work on, because each open source project provides an ideas list just to help you get started figuring out what you might want to do with them. And then you go ahead and start applying on March 28th. For those in the audience who would like to do this, I would like to encourage you to apply early and often. Most of the open source projects that we've worked with in the past have cited the fact that their best applications come in immediately upon applications opening, so just a nickel's worth of free advice. So let's say Google Summer of Code isn't quite right for you. That's okay, because Google Summer of Code has spawned a number of Summer of Code-like programs where college students are paid to work on open source projects for usually a 3-month duration, corresponding to the Northern Hemisphere summer. And this is everything from programs targeted directly at women, like the GNOME Women's Outreach Program. The folks in New Zealand, being avid open source users, the Kiwis are, pointed out quite rightly that when it was the Northern Hemisphere summer and Google was busy putting on Summer of Code, It wasn't really summer for the Kiwis and everyone in the southern hemisphere, so they came up with the New Zealand Summer of Code, which they hold during their summer. The Ruby project put on their own Summer of Code, so you can find mentorship programs related to specific programming languages. And then there's the Humanitarian FOSS project. They do 3-month summer internships for students who want to work on humanitarian-related open source software. There are many, many different options out there. I know about a lot of them, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that afterward if that's something that is interesting to you. How many of you have younger brothers and sisters or young children under the age of 18? See a couple of hands. Okay, excellent. This isn't so much for the folks in the audience now, but for those of us who are on the younger side of things, the Google Coding Contest, which was formerly known as the Google Highly Open Participation Contest, and thank goodness someone smarter than me came up with a much better name, was a program designed to get pre-university students involved in open source. So this, about 2 years ago, Google launched the world's first program to get folks involved in open source who are under the age of 18. No one had ever done this before. No one actually knew what needed to be done, and so we just kind of put the word out and said to our open source project friends, how many of you have bite-sized chunks of work? Easy, discrete tasks that you can put out there so that someone who doesn't have an extensive programming background or someone who wants to work on documentation or artwork or release engineering, bug triage, not just code, everything that goes into making an open source software project possible. Let us know what those tasks are, and we'll pay high school students to work on them. So for the second instance of that program, the Google Code-In, about 360 students worldwide completed almost 2,000 of those bite-sized tasks for open source projects in just 2 months. Pretty exciting, and this looks great on college applications. So if you have younger brothers and sisters or youngins, you might want to tell them that this is something fun for them to do. Other ways to get involved in open source. Get a job. Really, who doesn't want to get paid? It's a good thing. You can seek out an internship with an open source friendly company. There are many of those. Google, Intel, IBM, HP, you name it. And the great thing is you may not be specifically working on an open source project, but again, you'll get exposure to that open source software tool chain. And there are many pieces of open source software that typically go into making up these companies' infrastructure and products, so you'll get that kind of exposure. There are plenty of firms that are open source companies who are hiring interns left and right now, like our friends at Red Hat. This is me telling Mel to look up and smile, but that's okay, she's busy. I got it. Our friends over at Mozilla who just released Firefox 4. Anybody download it? What'd you think?
It's awesome.
It's awesome. I like that. Firefox is awesome.
A lot better than what I was using.
Excellent. And progress is always good.
I, in fact, need an intern at Red Hat.
Pardon me?
I need an intern at Red Hat.
This lovely lady needs an intern at Red Hat, and you should come and speak to Ruth when this presentation is over if you would like to learn more. Yes, sir?
We're also looking for interns for the Open EMR project.
The Open EMR project?
Yes.
I am not familiar with the Open EMR project. Please tell me more.